Chapter 2. Rachel must despise him. He wouldn't blame her for it. He'd been a fool. Nat called himself every sort of name as he moodily tramped up and down behind the stables, hands in pockets, kicking up gravel with every bitter step. The pretense was killing him. His impending marriage was a terrifying prospect. He wished Marianne and Susanna would hurry their preparations for the coach trip to London. They should have been on the road by now. What a ghastly few days lay ahead. At least he could make himself scarce with Susanna's brother, though. Truth be told, he didn't care overmuch for John these days. The lesser of two evils, though. Poor Marianne, reluctant enough to take part in the expedition, would have refused if she'd already met Susanna's mother. He'd had that dubious pleasure. There was some sort of adage, wasn't there, about looking at the mother and that's who the daughter would eventually resemble. Fortunately, there was nothing wrong with Mrs. Parker's looks, a pity about her character. What had possessed him to seduce Susanna? How could he have been so susceptible to her flattery? Her beauty. He'd never seen a woman so comely, with her deepest blue eyes, her flaxen hair and her unblemished pale skin. Her figure was a revelation to someone whose idea of the female form had been gained from the voluptuous creatures in the Titans and Van Loos that adorned the walls of his grandfather's mansion. What she could do with that delectable body, the pleasures he'd experienced in his bed with her astounded him. The ribald conversations with fellow students imparting the delights of bedding willing young women had been put in the shade by Susanna's skillful ministrations. None of those young men could have enjoyed carnal experiences as shattering as those he'd had with Susanna. It had been impossible to refrain from rogering her again and again. Little wonder, then, that barely 2 weeks ago she'd broken the news that she was with child. The shock of that disclosure had brought him down to earth. The first time he'd been with her, she was emphatic she'd been a virgin, yet she was remarkably adept at the sexual act. She'd glibly explained away the ease of her supposed first sexual experience by merry stories of riding horses bareback as a child. Her prodigious skills in bed, she'd said, were obviously a natural talent, heightened by her great love for him. She'd begged him not to tell a soul about her condition, but to proceed as rapidly as was considered seemly to marry her. His hands were tied. How could he explain himself to Rachel without betraying Susanna's trust? He'd seen Rachel's dismay when he'd clumsily taken his fiancée to the vicarage to introduce her to the Lawson family. In that instant, he'd known what he truly lost. The woman he should have been spending the rest of his life with, not the silly fligger-tigger-bit with whom he'd become entangled through his own crass stupidity. As each day went by, he grew increasingly irritated with Susanna and her coquetry. He'd watched her flutter around his father until that cold, aloof character was in her thrall. Every man she encountered became enchanted with her, all except Reverend Lawson. It wasn't just the women of that family who disapproved of her. He knew from long acquaintance when Rachel's father was less than pleased by something. Likewise, Lady Octavia. Constance had been another matter. That miss never refrained from the truth, and she'd no qualms about voicing her displeasure. Neither had his sister Marianne. Even his stepmother seemed disapproving, though she welcomed Susanna to the family politely enough. And Rachel. She'd been uncommonly gracious, but he'd seen the light go out of her eyes when he'd introduced Susanna as his fiancée. He'd been so ashamed of the way he'd broken the news, cowardly, the way he'd spoken to her. He'd hurt her so much. Did she ache inside the way he did now? Once he dared to hope, but no, it was much too late for that now. He'd give anything to take back the past 12 weeks, to go back to before he'd made Susanna's acquaintance. How could he have been so stupid? It was obvious now that Susanna, with the complicity of her brother, had set out to ensnare him, and he, fool that he was, had fallen right into their trap. The strain of pretending that he loved his fiancée, the remorse that ate at him. How could he have been so cruel to Rachel, so blind to her love for him? She tried to hide her sadness, her upset at his announcement of the betrothal, but he knew, and it was now far too late to remedy the situation. He'd been educated to always do the right thing in his conduct with others, so he must marry Miss Parker and try to forget Rachel and what might have been. Though in facing up to his responsibilities regarding Susanna, it was all so unfair to Rachel and devastating for himself. That much grew more and more obvious with every day that passed. Would the ache in his heart ever go away?